Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wildwood94. I hope you're doing well today. I have another book review for you. I have quite a few coming your way. I hope you're ready. Plus a book haul. I don't know if I mentioned that in the Haunted Mask 2 book review I did before this video. Anyway, today I have a book review for Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is my original copy that I've owned for like 7 years, 6 years, something like that. Now, I've read Dracula from Bram Stoker about 3 or 4 times now. Never got around to reading this one. It's like 200 pages on my copy, whereas freaking Dracula is like 500. You know, I don't even like the Dracula book. I have 2 copies of it. Why do I have that? I'm a hoarder, man. But I have Frankenstein. I actually have 3 copies of this book. I really like this Barnes & Noble Classics cover. I have one that I bought at Target a couple of years ago, too. The only reason I bought this, as bland as it looks with all the quotes and everything else, I love how it has Boris Karloff, my favorite adaptation monster of this whole book. I love it. He's on the cover. Looks great. I'm glad I bought that for that. But then there was a Barnes & Noble copy that I saw that I bought the matching Dracula book for as well. It's Frankenstein Mary Shelley with a black and red cover. It's a rubber cover, actually. Not a hardcover. It's like a rubber cover. It actually kind of flexes and stuff. Beautiful book. Look at the spine on this thing. Love it. Look at the back of this thing. I love that, too. The red 10 pages. When you open the front, it's very chemical and very H.P. Lovecraft. I love it so much. But, yeah. I finally read this. This is one of the books I read and wanted to get a review out, and I've been so busy this last month and a half, I have not been able to pump out reviews. I'm very sorry about that. Please forgive me for that, guys. It's been crazy, man. Just with work and my mental health and everything else after I get out of work. It's been insane. Absolutely insane. Just have not felt like reading or anything. So, this 200-page book, let me tell you a little story. I picked this book up at least 5 or 6 times over the last whatever amount of time I've had this book in my collection. I've been carrying it around everywhere. I have tried to read this book 5 or 6 times. I would get to right about the time the monster gets created, which is about 5 or 6 chapters into the book, and then I'd just put it down. I'd get distracted. I'd have something else come out, like a new movie or a new book. I'd get into that, or I'd get into comics or anything else. I had my Goosebumps interest that popped up. I never got around to finishing the book. I finally did. I finally did. I was not in the advanced courses in high school as much as I wanted to be a writer and everything. Back in my old Mr. Wildwood94 channel, I used to talk about that. I was not in the advanced courses at all, as much as I wanted to be a writer and as much as I love to read, even classical literature. I love to read that too, pretty much. I'm more of a horror guy, as you can tell from my channel, but still. And I desperately heard about this book all the time. I wanted to read it. After reading it, I think it's very accessible. More so than Dracula, more so than most classical literature, including Dickens. It amazes me that it took me this long to read it. But I will say, I'm incredibly, incredibly disappointed in a lot of ways. And not with the entire book, even. It's really an ending thing. Really like a third act thing. But I'll get there when I get there. Don't rush me to it. So, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What is this book about? Of course, you've probably seen the Boris Karloff film. Most people have. That's the iconic version. That's the one, in my personal opinion, after reading this, that's what should be celebrated. Not this book, that movie adaptation. Because that movie's better than this book. It's better than most of the adaptations of the book, but it's better than this book for sure. Now, this book is pretty much written as a semi-diary, semi-letter. At one point, the author kind of changes. It's mostly written from Victor Frankenstein's perspective, and unlike the adaptations you typically see to film and TV and whatnot, you actually get to see this book start off for the first couple of chapters with him in college and going to become an educated man, getting into science more so, getting into biology, and eventually spiraling into wanting to bring some kind of life to life, you know what I mean? And I can't remember if it's actually like dead body parts being sewn together. I think there was. But you don't get something like the classic lightning bolt strike that goes down a metal ceiling from a storm and hits the monster on a bed and brings it to life. We don't know how this monster gets brought to life. I'm assuming it's some kind of chemical thing, too. Even so, Victor goes on this crazy spiral. He kind of goes a little bit insane. He has a god complex. He wants to bring life into a body of some sort, and he does that. And he brings this thing to life. It's basically just referred to as the monster the entire book. And this monster's a little bit different from the Boris Karloff one. And I'll mainly reference that one because that's my personal favorite. I love Boris Karloff's Frankenstein monster. I love that series of movies. They just get better and better all the time. A lot of things I thought were going to be in this book because of idiots online who had not read the book, who just acted like they read the book. I was surprised, to be frank. Even so, I really, really, really love the first 100 pages of the book. It's great, it's so effective, it's dark, and very gothic, of course. It's called a gothic book, just like Bram Stoker's book is with Dracula. The thing is, I would consider Dracula a horror book before I would consider this a horror book. This has a lot of good themes about god complexes and man playing god and that kind of thing. Everybody talks about that. I don't want to deal with that. Everybody constantly mentions that in their reviews for this book. But for me, I really love the kind of the darker nature of this book compared to Dracula. And Dracula, I guess I consider that more of a horror book than I do this one. But this has a very gothic undertone to it. It has a very gothic architecture to the way the story is told, the way the feelings and the cold and everything. There's so many cold settings, so much snow and whatnot in the story itself. But Victor brings this monster to life, and he has a little bit of a falling out with it. He doesn't think it's as beautiful as he thought it was when he was building it and bringing it to life. He pretty much has a falling out and kicks this thing out of his room one night, and it goes away. This book kind of takes place over a couple of years, I want to say. Maybe a year or something like that. Maybe longer, maybe 5 years. I don't remember. It could be a while. I'm leaning towards 5 years, actually. Anyway, all of a sudden, Victor starts having all these tragedies in his life. People like his younger brother shows up dead, strangled to death. Certain friends and family members will start showing up like that throughout the book. And Victor's trying to figure out, what's the commonplace issue here? And after he finds a young woman that he's been friends with named Justine put on trial, she's put to death over this crime that he knows she did not commit, he realizes more and more, like even the court knew that she wasn't guilty. It was just a mob mentality thing. This book has a lot to say about mob mentality, too. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. But Victor eventually kind of goes on this personal vendetta. Once he comes across the monster again out in the wilderness, now the monster can talk. I won't get into the spoilers too much for this book. But, yeah, the monster's different from the Boris Karloff one. This monster is sympathetic, but in a very different way from the Boris Karloff one. The Boris Karloff monster in the entire first film is just a sympathetic, childlike being. That's all he is. He doesn't mean harm. He's just an entity. He doesn't really know any better. He's like a kid, a child, a baby, Whereas this monster starts out that way and turns into more of an adult that you're sympathetic for because of the terrible life that he has to deal with and the kind of judgment he gets from a lot of townsfolk and whatnot. He leads a very sad life. And at one point, what pissed me off the most, there is one character in this book who sits down with Victor Frankenstein, and this character talks to Victor for 30 or 40 pages in my copy. 30 or 40 pages out of this 200-page book are this person monologuing about what they've been into. No. You can do that in books, but it didn't work for Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged. It doesn't work for you either. I'm telling you right now, that irritated the living crap out of me. That's about 120 pages into my copy of the book, and that pissed me off. That was just like, I understand why this is here. Why is this divided up into different chapters, number one, for like 30, 40 pages? But number two, why? Why a big monologue about every detail and facet of this, God, if it had been Stephen King, it would have been like 80 or 90 pages of this, man. It would have been its own book, you know what I mean? It was a lot. I'm still getting over that. I have like PTSD to long monologues now. Anyway, and then like I said earlier in my review, so most of the book I loved. I think at least half the book I genuinely loved. But when you hit that monologue part, it starts to slow. The whole book, just the pacing and everything starts to slow down for me. Now, everybody in the book talks like Shakespeare. They do. And I don't mind that. It's the monologuing that kind of gets annoying after a while, but really, at the 120-page mark with that 30, 40 pages, just one character talking, not two characters in a conversation, but one character speaking about their whole life or whatever, that's insane. That's insane to me. It's just too much. From that point on, it just slowed down more and more. And then you got to the finale, the third act of the book, where I was pretty pissed, honestly. I felt completely gypped by the end of the book. I feel like the last chapter's a slap in the face to anybody who cared about Victor Frankenstein at all. As slow as the book had become, I was still rooting for him. I like Victor Frankenstein as a character. I think he's phenomenally written. I think he's better written than anybody, except for Dracula the monster himself from Bram Stoker's book. I like that character better than anybody in Dracula. I like his lover, his lifelong best friend, Elizabeth. I like her more than I like anybody in Dracula. Again, assuming you're not talking about Dracula the monster himself in that book, because he's great. But there's certain other aspects of this book, like the father. I really like Victor Frankenstein's dad. He's just a great character. He's well written. He's just a very sympathetic, good father, and I love him. I love them. There's a lot of Christian elements to this book that I really like a lot as a Christian. I really dig that. Very effective, very emotional in a lot of ways. But that final chapter of this book was such a slap in the face to anybody on this planet who was rooting for Victor Frankenstein because of the way the story is wrapped up. You don't even get a real confrontation in this book, and the way the confrontations you sort of kind of get ends is insulting. It's absolutely insulting. It's the dumbest ending I've ever read, and I would have never in my life expected that book to end that way. When I finished this book, I was sitting on the couch beside my wife, and I looked over at her with this face, and she looked at me back, and she was like, "You hated it, didn't you?" I was like, yeah, it's a terrible ending. That ending sucked. I am so glad that the Boris Karloff, James Whale film took all of the liberties that it did and changed so much. Because if it had not, it would have sucked. And this explains to me a lot of why a lot of the more faithful to the book adaptations have been so lame. Because they're so busy being a soap opera, like a lot of this book is, which is fine. I like soap operas, I like comics. A lot of comics are soap operas for the most part. I don't mind that. I love Star Wars, for God's sake. That's a soap opera. The CW comic book shows a lot of the time are more soap opera-ish than anything else, and I like those a lot of the time. Well, at least the older seasons. Anyway, so this is not a perfect book by any means, nor will it get a perfect review from me, because I'm so pissed off over it. I love a lot of characters in here. There's some great characters that even pop up later on in the book that are effective, and I really dig them. There's some great twists in here, some deaths that really got to me. It's an effective book. Not a really scary book. It has some cool things about it. I like the abilities of the monster himself. That's kind of neat. I like Victor's relationship with this monster and how he talks to him and deals with him when he comes across him sometimes. There's a great atmosphere to this book. It's a bigger story than what you'd expect for the kind of tale you're getting. If I had summarized this entire book to you, I think you would feel like there's not much to it. It feels more like a short story or novella. And when you're thinking about modern day writers like Stephen King, yeah, it feels like a short story compared to that. But when you're reading the actual book, it has a bigger scope than you actually expect, and it kind of surprised me a little bit, even though you're entirely focused on Victor's point of view, for the most part. But the ending sucked. I will stand by that till the day I die. That ending ruined my experience with this book. I hate it, and I'm pissed that I have 3 copies of this book now that I don't want to get rid of, because what if I read this again one day and like it more? That's the hoarding mentality that I'm stuck with. Anyway, Frankenstein. I'm very bummed out about this book. I'm not a fan of this book anymore. But I do think if you're a poetry fan, if you want to get into poetry or get into a poetic nature of writing for your novels or whatever, you should read this book. You can learn a lot from Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley was a damn good writer. She just could write her tail off. She had such a great talent. She's still living and thriving through this book because of how great her performance was and execution of this book when it comes to the writing style part of it. I'm not a big fan of the whole letters thing. I don't like that with Dracula either. I think it kind of slowed the whole book down too much. But with this one, it's fine. It's a 200-page book. It's not a big deal. But the actual explanations of, like, the Arctic, when they're out in the Arctic at certain parts of the story, it's beautiful. It's a beautifully written book. It has so much going for it. Again, if you love poetry, you should read this and take this kind of thing in. Really observe it. Really break it down and think about it. Mary Shelley has a lot to offer when it comes to this book. Anyway, when it comes to Frankenstein, if I had to rate the book on a 5-star basis, I'd give it like a 3 out of 5 stars. I would have given it way higher. If you had asked me the first 100 pages of the book, what would I give it? It would have been a 5 out of 5. But it sucked so bad from 120 onward, or whatever the monologue part of the book started. It just lost me so heavily that I was like, no, I'm not about this. And even in that kind of third act, the build up to the climax of the book, there were some things I did like there. But the actual ending of the book was the nail in the coffin, where I was like, I can't give this a 4 out of 5 stars either. It's a 3 out of 5 for me. That's my personal opinion. What are your thoughts on Frankenstein from Mary Shelley? Do you love the book? Do you hate the book? Put your thoughts in comments down below. Did you read this in high school? In one respect, I kind of wish I had, just so I could have prepared myself. If I had known how this book was going to end from some guy spoiling it on Reddit or something, you know, I think I could have prepped myself. Same thing with Iron Man 3. If I had known the twist at the end of the book about the end of the movie about the villain, I could have prepped myself to enjoy that more. Now I just hate it and cringe thinking about it. Same thing with this. Same thing with this. So now I'm going to take all 3 of my copies, put them in a nice little tote down in my basement, and not read them for years. Anyway, 3 out of 5 stars for me. What are your thoughts? Put them down below, guys. I would love to hear what you have to say about it. Do you like this more than Dracula? Even with the bad ending, I like this more than Dracula. Hands down, no questions asked whatsoever. I think it's a better written book. It's beautiful. It's sweet. The gothic nature of it's wonderful, dude. It's just wonderful. If you like darker stuff, it's a great book for you. Great characters, too, including the monster. The monster's very sympathetic. Anyway, what are your thoughts? Check it out if you haven't read it. Yeah, the Boris Karloff film, that's the best. That's the best. That's the best rendition of this entire story that's ever existed. Just stick with that. If you haven't seen it before, watch that movie before you read the book. I think you'll love it. Anyway, thank you for watching. God bless you guys. Happy Thanksgiving once again, and goodbye.